Last Sunday we began our study of the book of Daniel with some introduction, and this week we'll just do a little bit more before we get into chapter 1 next Sunday, Lord willing. Last Sunday we focused especially on who Daniel was and what that pivotal moment was in Israel's history. And just a few other things this week, especially related to Jesus and then kind of the overall purpose of this book. So before we get to the main things, let me just begin with a couple of miscellaneous things this morning. And first of all, just a comment about the criticism of Daniel. For the last 150 years, there has been a lot of criticism of this book. And the reason is very simple. It's because Daniel lived in the 500s BC and described the rise and, the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the rise and fall of the Persian Empire, the rise and fall of the Greek Empire, and then the coming of the Roman Empire. And so from the standpoint of a secular historian, that just can't be. Daniel cannot have been in the 500s because it's impossible to foretell the future like that. So if you go to, State College and take a book that deals with, the Bible as literature, they will teach you that the second half of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, were written in the 160s BC. And then whoever wrote that also collected some Jewish fables about Daniel and put them together to make the beginning of the book interesting. So the first 6 chapters are kind of legends, fables about Daniel, and the second section is written as the events happened, but kind of pretending to be prophecy. But Bible scholars have very carefully demonstrated that Daniel is historically trustworthy. There are some hard questions, and we'll talk about those at various points in the book. The primary reason why there are hard questions is because Daniel kind of sits at a point in history at which our historical data starts to get very slim. We just don't have a lot of historical sources about that time period in history when you're in the 500s and 600s and so forth BC. And so Daniel talks about people that secular history doesn't refer to. But to conclude that they didn't exist is folly. So we'll talk about some of those things as we go along. But as Joyce Baldwin has written, I strongly assert that there is no reason to question Daniel's historical knowledge. And actually, there are a bunch of reasons why the book can't have been written in the 160s BC. And we'll talk about those later. Secondly, I wanted to comment on the Hebrew and Aramaic in Daniel. You might have heard that Daniel is one of 2 books in the Old Testament that include sections written in Aramaic, and that's chapters 2 through 7 of Daniel. And really, Daniel is unique in this regard because the other book that includes Aramaic is Ezra, and what's the Aramaic in Ezra is letters that were written in Aramaic and are just being quoted. So Daniel's the only book in the Old Testament that actually has its own writing in Aramaic. And Hebrew and Aramaic were directly related. If you're at all familiar with like Mandarin and Cantonese or something where you have the same letters but 2 different languages, that was the case with Hebrew and Aramaic. They look identical, but they don't read identically. And in Daniel's day, Aramaic was kind of like English is today. It was kind of the standard government language. It was the kind of universal language that everybody shared for official business and so forth. And so Aramaic would have been the language that Daniel used all the time in his government roles. But why would he write part of the book in Hebrew and part of it in Aramaic? The Bible doesn't tell us why, but if we try to make an educated guess, it's interesting that the chapters in Daniel that are in Aramaic are the same chapters that really go through those 4 world empires and talk about what's going on in the world empires at Daniel's time. The other chapters deal more with the Jewish people and their future in relationship to their persecution. So we don't know why he wrote part of it in Aramaic, but it is definitely worth considering the possibility that Daniel chapters 2 through 7 were actually published separately in Aramaic for secular people to read, basically, for government officials in the Persian government to be able to read, and for people in that time to be able to read, because they dealt with the empires of their time. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later when we talk about the structure, but I just wanted to comment on that briefly. But let's move on now to consider the connection between Daniel and Jesus. One of the reasons to be very excited to study Daniel is because there are so many important connections to Jesus. If your picture of Daniel is of kind of an obscure, weird, prophetic Old Testament book and kind of unrelated to Jesus in the New Testament, I hope we can completely change that perception, because if you love Jesus, it's easy to get excited about the book of Daniel. So let me just very briefly introduce that, because this will be the stuff we talk about all the way through the series, but just a few quick headings. Number one, the whole book of Daniel points to Jesus as the fulfillment of every hope. Earlier this week, I read through Daniel just looking for what people are looking for in Daniel. What is everybody wanting? Because when you list that out, you find that Jesus is the answer for all of those hopes. We want to remember that the overall message of the Old Testament and of every book in the Old Testament points to Jesus. If you want to know how the Old Testament points to Jesus, it's not just this specific messianic prophecy and this specific messianic prophecy. It's the whole thing, like a giant arrow pointing toward Jesus. So look at the book of Daniel and what everybody's looking for and what everybody's hoping for, and you find it's Jesus. The people in the book are hoping for a great and powerful king who is unstoppable, a king who will live and reign forever, ruling a kingdom that can never be destroyed. Nobody wants their nation to end. Nobody wants to be taken over by another government. They're all longing for rulers who will endure and a kingdom that can never be destroyed. They're also wanting a king who can triumph over evil tyrants and deliver his people from oppression, and even triumph in the angelic realms and among the heavenly beings. What kind of ruler has that kind of power? They're looking for someone who is both a son of God and a son of man. God in the flesh dwelling with mankind. Who could be that? They're looking for someone who is blameless and righteous before God and rules with righteousness and mercy for the oppressed. Someone who has the spirit of the gods in him and possesses the wisdom of the gods. Someone who is faithful and always keeps his promises. Someone with majesty and glory, who is honorable and worthy to be worshipped. Someone who can atone for iniquity and put an end to sin and make sinners into saints. Someone who hears prayers and shows mercy and forgives rebellion and wickedness. Someone who can be with you even in the fire and the lion's den. Someone who is a deliverer. Someone who can give resurrection unto eternal life. A God who might even call us by his own name and greatly love us and let us share in his kingdom. Do you think they ended up a little disappointed with their rulers when that's what they were hoping for? No earthly ruler could begin to touch that description of the hope of the human heart, but Jesus could. Number two, Jesus probably appears in a Christophany multiple times in Daniel. So by the word Christophany, that word is used to refer to an appearance of the Son of God before he came to earth as a man. So times in the Old Testament when it seems that the Son of God appeared on earth, and that happened at least 3 different times, it seems, in the book of Daniel. Number 3, the book of Daniel directly prophesies about Jesus. The most famous of those is in Daniel chapter 7, where there's a vision of God the Father, the Ancient of Days, on his throne, and one like a son of man comes to him and is given an everlasting kingdom. That is undoubtedly Jesus. Daniel chapter 9 also talks about a prince who, during a time frame when sin is put to an end and iniquity is atoned for and everlasting righteousness is brought in. Well, once again, that prince has to be Jesus. And it's possible that in that same section in Daniel chapter 9, the book actually predicts the precise year of the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We'll have to talk about that again when we get there. So the book directly prophesies about Jesus. Number 4, Jesus would have read and studied Daniel. That is so cool for me to think about. As a perfect, righteous human being, we know that Jesus loved the scriptures. Like that heart of Psalm 119 was Jesus' heart perfectly, completely. And so his teachings were soaked in the scriptures. Luke 2 tells us about how, as a little boy, his parents found him in the temple with the teachers, listening and asking questions. He loved the words of his father and the ways of his father. And I don't begin to understand the relationship between, omniscience and Jesus growing and learning as a human being. But we can be certain that Jesus studied and, in a sense, learned from the scriptures as he grew up and grew in wisdom and listened and learned in the temple. And so Jesus read and studied the book of Daniel and read about himself in the book of Daniel and understood it like nobody else ever has. And that leads us to number 5 then. Jesus quoted Daniel. Matthew 24, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. The abomination of desolation is a phrase that comes directly from Daniel. The phrase shows up 3 different times in the book of Daniel, and then the words, I think, a couple other times. And note that Jesus not only uses that phrase, but he also says that the phrase was spoken by Daniel, affirming that Daniel was a real historical person, affirming Daniel's authorship of the book. He also says that Daniel was a, what? Prophet, affirming Daniel's role as an instrument of God's revelation. And he says, in parentheses, you see it? Let the reader understand. The reader of what? Not the reader of him. He's talking out loud to them. What's he mean when he says, let the reader understand? You reading Daniel. You who are reading Daniel in 30 AD. Understand what you're reading from the prophet Daniel. So that's amazing. Jesus affirms that it's important for people many centuries after Daniel to read Daniel and understand what he's saying and apply it to their own time. So there in that little quote, Jesus affirms the historicity of Daniel, Daniel's authorship of the book, Daniel's role as an instrument of God's revelation, and the enduring importance of the book of Daniel for every generation. Number 6, Jesus applied Daniel to future events. That's right there in Matthew 24. Jesus said to his audience, basically, watch for what Daniel said was going to happen. So as of that point in time in history, some of the things Daniel talked about hadn't happened yet. And they were supposed to be watching for them, which means that even if the critics were right and the book of Daniel was written in the 160s, that still doesn't solve the problem at all, because he talked about too many things that go way past the 160s BC. It doesn't solve the problem unless Daniel was written, sometime in the future after Jesus comes again, which is unlikely, since we're studying it today. Number 7, some of the most important themes in Jesus' teaching expand upon Daniel. We could also say are based upon Daniel, and yet they then take them and expand them. So I'm just giving you examples, and once we've studied these things, there could be so much more here. But just really briefly, first of all, the concept of the Son of Man. Now, that phrase, Son of Man, is common in the Old Testament. It's used a lot of times, and not just in the book of Daniel. But in the book of Daniel, the Son of Man comes to the Ancient of Days and is given an eternal global kingdom. And then Jesus uses the phrase Son of Man. It's in the Gospels more than 80 times. And Jesus uses the phrase Son of Man in the Daniel sense of a mighty global king. And so the way Jesus so frequently taught himself about himself as the Son of Man really comes straight from Daniel. Secondly, the idea of this king over all the kings, king who is greater than all the kings. The most common key words in the book of Daniel are king and kingdom, more than 200 times in the 12 chapters. And so that's what Daniel's about. It's about kings and kingdoms, and it promises a final king who is truly the King of Kings, who conquers all the others. And Jesus comes and describes himself as that king. You read the Gospels, and just like Daniel is full of the talk of king and kingdoms, the Gospels are full of talk of king and kingdoms in the teachings of Jesus. And then Daniel talked about a global kingdom. The way it's described in Daniel is a kingdom for all peoples, nations, and languages. To the Son of Man was given this global dominion, a kingdom that fills the whole earth, which, isn't that what all those ancient emperors dreamed of? I mean, isn't that what rulers do? Isn't that what Ukraine is about right now? Right? The human heart of a human ruler wants to expand his territory as far as he can expand his territory. And Daniel promised a truly global king, and Jesus said, I'm going to be that universal king. And finally, the reign of the saints. As I mentioned last week, this is one of the most startling themes in Daniel, that Jesus is the final, ultimate King of Kings, and yet God's people rule with Jesus. And so if we look at the words of Jesus, both in the Gospels and in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, where Jesus speaks, we see that Jesus taught that exact same thing, the reign of the saints. And so if you look at that, those 4 big ideas, and then all of those connections we just talked about between Daniel and Jesus, it's just so evident that the hand of God was upon Daniel, inspiring these words to point ahead to the ultimate king who was coming at the exact time that Daniel predicted. And so, since we love Jesus and want to learn more about Jesus, Daniel's a great book to study. The perception is, if you want to know Jesus, study the Gospels. But as Jesus himself said, if you want to know Jesus, study the whole of the Scriptures, because they're all about him. Here's another way to say it. The Bible gives what we call progressive revelation. In other words, the Bible wasn't written all at once. God didn't reveal everything all at once. It unfolds over time. Things that are fuzzy back here become clear up here. Mysteries are revealed as you go along. Truths build upon truths. And so we could think of Daniel like a rosebud that's not really open fully yet. Now, a rosebud has a lot of substance to it, and it also has a certain beauty to it, and you can look at it and study it and enjoy it. But you're not satisfied with a rosebud just being a bud. You really want to know what is packaged up inside that. All those little petals jammed together, waiting to spring into life. And so Daniel is like that. It's like a bud, and when Jesus comes, it like bursts into life and fullness. Now, we know that even that flower hasn't opened all the way yet, right? There's still more truths in Daniel to unfold. But so many things that are fuzzy in Daniel become clear in Jesus. In Daniel, we see the shadows. In Jesus, we see the substance. In Daniel, we see the imagery. In Jesus, we see the concrete reality. And so that doesn't mean that since Jesus has come, we, kind of take everything before Matthew and pull it out of our Bible. Actually, we go back and look at the scriptures, and they help us know Jesus better. We see how they pointed us to Jesus, how they illustrated Jesus, how they prepared us for Jesus. And so, again, when we love Jesus and want to learn more about Jesus, Daniel's a great book to study. All right. Very briefly, I want to comment on Daniel and Revelation. Basically, the fingerprints of Daniel are all over the book of Revelation. And we won't begin to start looking at that this morning, but the structure of Revelation is connected to Daniel, the imagery in Revelation, the beasts in Revelation. You really can think of Revelation like Daniel part 2 or the rest of the story. In other words, Daniel and Revelation aren't just two individual prophetic books. Revelation is the sequel to Daniel. It's the final stage in the Bible's progressive revelation. And it connects very directly to Daniel. So, do you get the idea from all that Daniel relates to the New Testament in a very unique way? All of the Old Testament books relate to the New Testament, but Daniel is, it's just unique. There's just nothing like it in how much the New Testament is based upon key concepts there. All right, finally, this morning, I want to talk about the purpose of this book, and this is under the heading Daniel and his audience's future. And I am being so foolish this morning as to propose a purpose statement for the book before we've studied it. So please allow me to come back later and just change this. But here's a starting point for us. The purpose of the book of Daniel. I'm going to use 3 words this morning. The purpose of the book of Daniel is to guide, comfort, and prepare the people of God as they live under the authority of the world's political powers until Jesus comes again. The purpose of the book of Daniel is to guide, comfort, and prepare the people of God as they live under the authority of the world's political powers until Jesus comes again. Note that in that sentence there are 2 different kind of time frames in view. The words guide and comfort point to the present moment, whatever we might be going through. The book guides us and comforts us right now. And then the word prepare points ahead to what we will go through. This book prepares us to be ready for what is coming. There in your handout, so do we get those 3 words, right? Guide, comfort, and prepare. On your handout, I put a little bit of the timeline that we had last Sunday. Just a couple bullet points I wanted to remind us about the timing of Daniel and Israel's history. When Daniel begins for Israel, it's a time of destruction and exile, losing their land, their temple, their leadership, and their national identity. 440 years later, so that's that 160s BC, the Jews experienced their worst season of persecution ever up to that point. And then 670 years later, so 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. So as you just look at those 3 points, you can see that God's people needed help in the present, and they were going to need help in the future. They needed guidance and comfort right then in exile in Babylon. And yet they also needed to be preparing future generations for some horrible things that were going to come later on. In the book of Daniel, he was foretelling those events 440 and 670 years later so that the people of God could be prepared. So the book is both providing comfort and guidance in that current moment, right then in exile, and preparing them for what's coming in the future. So you can see there that there are two kind of subpoints on your handout. The first is Daniel is for suffering believers, and the second on the back page is Daniel is to prepare believers for suffering. So let's take number one. First of all, Daniel is for suffering believers. Remember that Daniel's original audience would have been the Jewish people who were in exile in Babylon. They had lost basically everything, and so gloom and grief hung over them. Look at Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. For there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? There was gloom and there was grief. And many of you know grief. Or some of you have even sometimes described to me like the gloom that you feel like is just kind of sitting on your life. The cloud that you're under. Or you very much feel like you're living in a foreign land and don't want to be living here. Or you feel like you've lost so much. Daniel's original audience would have understood, and really far more than what we've experienced. This book is for suffering believers. And in addition to gloom, in addition to grief, there was also bewilderment for them. I mean, on one hand, what was happening to them was just what God told them was going to happen. And yet, at the same time, it was still hard to understand. How could God allow his temple to be destroyed? Like, for much of their history, that had just seemed like fundamentally impossible. That will never happen, even though the prophet said, that's going to happen, that's going to happen, that's going to happen. How could God allow the precious things in the temple, the things that were set apart for the worship of God, how could he allow some Babylonian king to take him to the temple of some false god and worship with them? How could God allow that? After all that went into God promising to his people a land, and Abraham and Moses and Joshua and finally in the land and all that, how could God allow the people to be completely taken out of their land to a different nation? And after all the promises of kings and the enduring kingdom of David, how could God allow the line of Israel's kings to come to an end? It was really hard to understand. And many of you know what it's like to be in a situation that just doesn't make any sense to you. You can't see what God could possibly be doing here. And so along with the gloom and the grief and the bewilderment came uncertainty. What's going to happen? Do we have any future? Where is this even headed? And of course, along with the gloom and the grief and the bewilderment and the uncertainty came temptation. The temptation to just give up and basically become a Babylonian. They were called to be a holy, distinct people. And that is hard. That is wearing, that is exhausting, that is costly. And so there was a temptation that many of them gave into to just give up on trying to be God's holy people and live like the Babylonians and accept their gods, and life would be so much easier that way. And so these writings of Daniel came at the lowest point in their history, right when they needed it. And so if you're at a low point in your life, I pray that there will be some things in Daniel that the Lord will use to really encourage you. Daniel is for suffering believers. Now, to the back page, Daniel is also to prepare believers for suffering. Daniel described how the Babylonian Empire would fall to the Persians, how the Persian Empire would fall to the Greeks, and then how the Jews would suffer tremendously under the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes around 170 BC. Dale Davis calls that persecution under Antiochus the deadliest peril Israel ever confronted up to that point in their history. Antiochus attempted the entire destruction of both the people of Israel and their religion. But God used the writings of Daniel to get them ready. And we know historically that during that time, the time of the Maccabees that you're probably familiar with, they used the book of Daniel during that time. But it wasn't just for that one incident around in the 160s BC, because Antiochus was just like a model, a prototype of the arrogant rulers who would continue century after century to rise up against the people of God, both Jew and Gentile. You see it in the Roman destruction of Jerusalem 40 years after Jesus. You see it in the Roman persecution of the Christians in those first 300 years after Jesus. You see it if we jump way ahead to the Holocaust. You see it in governments today like China and North Korea and Afghanistan that try so hard to shut down Christianity. You see it even in the hostility of many American political leaders today toward the Bible and toward churches and toward Christian truth and toward religious liberty. Antiochus was like a prototype of what would come and come and come and come and come in worldly empires. But if we're understanding the Bible correctly, things aren't going to get better. They're actually going to keep getting worse, leading to the ultimate fulfillment of Antiochus Epiphanes, the one final Antichrist who will rise up against God and his people. And so Davis again has written that through this book of Daniel, God's goodness was at work forearming his people for what they would face. And what's so stunning about that is it wasn't forearming them for one thing they would face or what one generation would face. It was forearming all of God's people for all of the rest of time for what they would face. Think about it. It's 2022, right? And we are reading a book that was read by Jewish people in the 500s BC in exile in Babylon, and it comforted them. And we are reading a book that was read by Jewish people in the 160s BC under Antiochus Epiphanes, and it strengthened them. And we are reading a book that was read by people in the 60s AD who were facing the destruction of Jerusalem. We are reading a book that was read by Jesus, who would be crucified by the Romans. We are reading a book who was read by Christians dying under Nero, read by Jews in the Holocaust, read by Christians all over the world today in all sorts of political and national settings that are actually way worse than ours. And we're reading a book that will be read and studied by Jews and Christians living under the final and ultimate onslaught of the Antichrist someday. Whoa! See your moment in the big picture of what God is doing. And see this book in the big picture of what God is doing. And know that God is preparing you. Last week I said, we don't know what's going to happen in our world while we study the book of Daniel. We don't know what's going to happen in our country. We don't know what's going to happen in our state. And you don't know what's going to happen in your life. Now, does that just totally terrify you? Why do you think Daniel's in the Bible? Because if you stop and really think about what's coming that you don't know about, you're going to go crawl in a hole. You'll be so terrified. But God knows that. He knows what's coming. He rules what's coming. And so he knows exactly how to get you ready for what's coming that you don't know about. I decided not to talk about genre in this introduction, but there are several genres in Daniel, and there's a lot of discussion about whether Daniel is what they would call apocalyptic literature. And I just put this quote on your handout about the difference between prophecy and apocalyptic. Prophecy speaks to those who have backslidden and begs them to repent. Apocalyptic speaks to the faithful and urges them to persevere. In John 15, Jesus described to his followers the way that the world would hate them and even kill them. And then he said, John 16, verse 1, I have said all these things to you to keep you from falling away. Do you see how Jesus was getting them ready? He said in John 16, 3 and 4, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. But I have said these things to you that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told them to you. See, one of the things the final Antichrist is going to have going against him is the fact that the Bible already talked about him long before he ever showed up. And Jesus there in John 16 was getting his followers ready for crucifixion, for the persecution, for what was going to happen in the days of the early church. 1 Peter 4 verse 12, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. Daniel shows us the way human governments work. It shows us the kind of corruption that characterizes them. It shows us the way that rulers operate in their ignorance, their arrogance and ignorance. It shows the way empires rise and fall. It shows the way the whole flow of history will go. And it shows us all of that to help us understand how to live wisely under the authority of the nations of the world, because that authority is from God. You will live under it. How to live wisely under the authority of the nations of the world and how to be ready when the persecution comes. Matthew 10:28, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Jesus was getting them ready. Richard Wurmbrand was a Jewish Christian in Romania in the mid-1900s who, in a kind of very dramatic public way, renounced communism, preached the gospel. He and his wife preached to Jewish soldiers in World War II, rescued Jewish children out of the ghettos. They were repeatedly arrested and beaten. His wife lost her family in the Jewish concentration camps. When the communists took Romania, Wurmbrand witnessed in every way possible to the Russian troops. They say that he oversaw the distribution of 1 million copies of the Gospels to Russian soldiers in the occupation of Romania. In 1948, the secret police, once the Romanian government had become communist, the secret police arrested him and placed him in solitary confinement. His wife was arrested 2 years later. Her imprisonment lasted 3 years. His lasted, I think, a total of 14. The reason I bring that up is because the Togo team has been reading John Piper's book about missions. And in that book, he quotes Wurmbrand. I want to read that to you. And as you listen to this, think of the book of Daniel, given by God to prepare his people for suffering. So Wurmbrand wrote, what shall we do about these tortures? Will we be able to bear them? If I do not bear them, I put in prison another 50 or 60 men whom I know, because that is what the communists wish from me, to betray those around me. And here comes the great need for the role of preparation for suffering, which must start now. It is too difficult to prepare yourself for it when the communists have put you in prison. I remember my last confirmation class before I left Romania. I took a group of 10 to 15 boys and girls on a Sunday morning, not to a church, but to the zoo. Before the cage of lions, I told them, your forefathers in faith were thrown before such wild beasts for their faith. Know that you also will have to suffer. You will not be thrown before lions, but you will have to do with men who would be much worse than lions. Decide here and now if you wish to pledge allegiance to Christ. We have to make preparation now before we're imprisoned. In prison, you lose everything. You are undressed and given a prisoner's suit. No more nice furniture, nice carpets, or nice curtains. You do not have a wife anymore, and you do not have your children. You do not have your library, and you never see a flower. Nothing of what makes life pleasant remains. Nobody resists who has not renounced the pleasures of life beforehand. That's someone who knew very well what it meant to be literally tortured for Christ, and he is saying to us, you need to get ready in advance. But it's hard to get ready in advance. What does that even mean? And of course, I know there's another sense in which we have to trust that God will strengthen us in the moment when we're not ever going to be as ready as we wish we were. I know that's true too. But what I want us to understand here is that when we say, I need to be prepared, what we do then is we go to God's word and we trust that he knows how through his word to prepare us. Trying to prepare for what you don't know in the future is impossible unless there's actually a book written by the God who knows the future using that book to prepare you. Then it's possible. So we don't have to know tomorrow. We just have to listen to the God who knows tomorrow and let him take the book of Daniel and get us prepared. Now, unfortunately, some Christians today would be tempted to read Daniel entirely through the lens of current American politics. And if they heard me say, you need to get prepared, you need to get ready in advance, they would immediately think of political preparation. And I am entirely supportive of Christian political preparation. All of us are thinking about that. All of us who are living here in California are asking hard questions about what might be coming, what is coming, how do we get ready for what's coming. And we may find some principles in Daniel that will help us. But first, Daniel is going to prepare our hearts. Because if you do end up in prison someday, you know what you're not going to be doing? Checking your political party affiliation card to find endurance to get you through. Whew, I'm a Republican, I can do this. There's going to have to be something in your heart a lot deeper than that. So I am not discrediting in any way the kind of preparation that needs to be happening practically and politically. I'm not discounting that. But I think we would all agree that if you prepare in all those ways and your heart isn't ready, then none of the rest of it matters. And Daniel is going to go after your heart. The reason why Daniel and his friends were able to serve in terrible governments for 70 years was because of something in their hearts. They understood God and his hand in the empires of this earth. The reason why Daniel could honor, it's going to be startling to see how much Daniel honors terrible leaders in this book. Why could he do that? Because of something in his heart that understood God's sovereign appointment of those rulers. The reason why Daniel did not defile himself with the king's food, the reason why he was ready for the lion's den, the reason why his friends were courageous enough to face the fiery furnace was because of the love in their hearts for God that made them fiercely loyal to God. So in Daniel, we're going to talk about rulers and we're going to talk about governments, but Daniel isn't going to give us a strategy for taking back the House or Senate in midterm elections. It's going to go after our hearts, that we might know and love and trust the God revealed in the book of Daniel, that we might grasp his majesty and his awesome power and his wisdom, and that we might marvel at the way he controls the course of history, that we might read today's headlines and see the hand of God, that we might see Jesus and love Jesus and worship Jesus and follow Jesus with all of our hearts, that our loyalty to Jesus might grow so deep that nothing could get us to betray him. We don't know whether fierce persecution is months away or decades away, but if you understand the word persecution, you understand that it's already here. maybe in your phone, and the gambling app, maybe on the internet and the stuff you want to watch, maybe through your chronic pain that could push you away from the Lord, maybe through your bad church experience you had in the past that has tempted you to withdraw and pull back from God and question His goodness. Maybe through coworkers, maybe through teammates, maybe through the government. If you happen to live in a situation where the government isn't trying to get you to deny Jesus, the world is still trying, the flesh is still trying, and the devil is still trying. So it's not like it's only Christians in places of serious persecution who have to prepare. It's Christians who are human beings who have to prepare. And so the book of Daniel will draw us closer to God through Jesus Christ, that our hearts might be so full of love for Him that no one, no government, no law, no fine, no threat, no imprisonment, no torture could turn us away from the loyalty of our love for God. That no worldly temptation, no app, no dollar signs, no website, no earthly pleasure, no hurt from a past church experience, no chronic pain could get us to turn our back on our Savior and our God. So I wonder if you might be willing to pray something like this. Father, would you please use the book of Daniel to fill my heart with so much love for you and awe of you and trust in you that nothing could turn me away from you. Can I just give you a moment to pray, if you're willing, from your heart, something like that right now?